Section 1. The Griffin Family and the Nature of Wanting More. There is something quietly remarkable about what Family Guy managed to do across more than 2 decades of television that almost nobody gives it credit for. Between the cutaway gags and the non sequiturs and the moments of deliberate, gleeful offense, the show built something that functions as a sustained and surprisingly honest portrait of compulsion. Not addiction in the clinical sense, not the kind you would find broken down into stages in a medical textbook, but the messier, more human version of it. The version where someone finds a thing that makes them feel a certain way, and they reach for it again, and then the reaching becomes the whole shape of who they are for a while, and the people around them watch and wait and do not quite know what to do. The Griffin household at 31 Spooner Street in the small fictional Rhode Island town where all of this takes place is, on the surface, a fairly ordinary suburban home. There is a living room with a television. There is a kitchen where Lois cooks dinner and Peter sits at the table and says something that a reasonable person would not say. There is a bedroom for each of the children. There is a backyard. There is a neighborhood, complete with neighbors who have their own lives and their own problems, and a local bar called the Drunken Clam, where 4 friends meet almost every evening to drink beer and talk about things that do not particularly need to be talked about. But the ordinariness of the surface is the point. Family Guy, at its best, was always a show about what lives underneath the ordinary surface, about the wants and the lacks and the specific hungers that a suburban sitcom setting contains, but does not usually permit itself to look at directly. The Griffins are not a family that has things together. Peter Griffin is a large man with a large appetite and a very small ability to regulate either. Lois holds the family in place through a combination of patience, practicality, and a past that the show occasionally reveals in ways that suggest she is not quite the steady presence she performs. Brian, the family dog who moves through the house like a person who went to college and has not entirely recovered, keeps a bottle of scotch in a safe deposit box that he has not told anyone about. Stewie, the youngest, who speaks like a character from a 1930s radio drama and has built functional time travel equipment in his bedroom, cannot resist a drink when one presents itself. Even Chris and Meg, the 2 middle children who mostly exist in the periphery of the show's attention, have their own encounters with the pull of things that are not good for you. What makes the show's addiction stories worth examining as a body of work is not that they are particularly accurate or particularly responsible in how they handle the subject. Family Guy is not a public health broadcast. It does not have an obligation to accuracy, and it does not always honor whatever small obligations it does have. What makes these stories interesting is the consistency of the underlying logic. Across every addiction arc the show ever ran, across every episode that put a character in front of something they could not stop reaching for, the same dynamic recurs. The substance or the behavior arrives to solve a problem that already exists. The character was already broken in some specific way before the thing appeared. The thing offers to fix the broken part. It does fix it, briefly, and then the fixing becomes the new problem. This is the architecture of every meaningful addiction story in the Family Guy universe, from Brian's cocaine spiral in the 3rd season to the cough syrup that finds its way into Stewie's hands in season 13, from Peter's relationship with food and beer and the various substances the show dropped into his life across 20-plus years to the Vault episode in season 8, where Brian admits something about himself in the dark that he has never said to anyone out loud. Before we get into the individual episodes, it is worth spending a moment with the setting, because the setting matters more than it usually gets credit for. Spooner Street is a specific kind of place. It is a street in a small New England city, the kind of place where people have been living next door to each other for years and have developed the particular, compressed familiarity of people who share a block. Joe Swanson across the street, Cleveland and later the Quagmires nearby, the Drunken Clam a short drive or a long stumble away, the church that Peter occasionally attends when the plot requires it, the schools, the brewery where Peter works, eventually, after the toy factory and various other professional misadventures. This is not a place of high stakes or dramatic geography. It is a place where the stakes are domestic and the geography is familiar, and where the drama, if you can call it that, emerges from the gap between what people want and what they have. Peter wants to be happy. Brian wants to be respected. Stewie wants control. And all of them, at various points in the show's run, reach for something external to fill an internal space that the thing they have reached for was never equipped to fill. We are going to move through every significant instance of addiction and compulsion in the show's history, from the very first seasons to the middle period to the later years. We are going to spend time with each episode, with each character's specific hunger and the specific thing they reached for and what happened when they reached for it. We are going to talk about what the show got right and where it fumbled. And we are going to do all of this slowly and without hurry, because this is the kind of story that deserves to be told at a pace that lets you actually hear it. So settle in. Put your feet up if you have somewhere to put them. The drunken clam is open. Brian is nursing a martini that is not his first. Peter is on his third or fourth beer and has not started counting yet. Stewie is in his crib, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. And the story begins. Before we go any further, wherever you are watching this right now, drop it in the comments. The time, the place, what you are doing with your evening or your morning or whatever part of the day this is for you. Whether it is 3 in the morning and the only thing keeping you company is the glow of a screen, or a lazy Sunday afternoon with nowhere particular to be, I want to know. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. It is completely free and it means a great deal. Section 2. The Toad-Licking Epidemic. Let's go to the Hop, Season 2. The second season of Family Guy contains an episode that manages to do several things at once with the particular effortless confidence of early Family Guy working at full capacity. It is called Let's Go to the Hop. It aired on June 6th of the year 2000. And its central premise is the arrival of a drug craze in a Rhode Island high school. A drug craze based around licking the backs of hallucinogenic toads. Now, before you set that aside as pure absurdism, it is worth noting that the show is not inventing the phenomenon entirely. Bufo alvarius, which is commonly called the Colorado River toad or the Sonoran desert toad, secretes from its skin a compound called 5-methoxy-N, N-dimethyltryptamine, which is a powerful psychedelic substance. People have, in documented reality, used the secretions of these animals to achieve altered states. The toxin can be smoked or, in smaller quantities, absorbed through the mucous membranes. Licking the toads directly is both genuinely possible and genuinely dangerous, for reasons that extend well beyond just the psychedelic effects, but the possibility is real. Family Guy takes this fact, inflates it to cartoonish dimensions, and then uses the inflation as a frame for one of its sharpest early commentaries on how drug panics actually operate in American society. The episode begins with a news segment. Tom Tucker, the fictional anchor of the local news program, delivers coverage of the toad situation with the exactly right combination of solemnity and barely suppressed sensationalism. He lists the various street names for toad-licking lily-padding, Frenching the Prince, doing Kermit with the kind of straight-faced specificity that makes news coverage of drug panics both alarming and faintly absurd even in real life. The joke is not that the anchor is wrong about the facts. The joke is the format. This is recognizably the tone and structure of a real news segment about a teen drug crisis, applied to frogs, and the fit is so perfect that it becomes funny precisely because it is not exaggerated enough. The real news sounds exactly like this. What has happened is this. A plane belonging to a Colombian drug cartel, which was transporting a shipment of hallucinogenic toads, has crashed somewhere near the town. The toads have escaped. The toads have been found by teenagers. The teenagers, as teenagers have always and will always do with anything that is both slightly forbidden and socially legible as cool, have started licking them. Peter and Lois, sitting at home watching the news coverage, experience the precise species of parental anxiety that the show is very good at capturing in its early seasons, not quite hysteria, not quite indifference, but the slightly helpless worry of people who are aware that something is happening at their children's school and do not entirely understand what it is or how to address it. They go through Chris's pockets. They find a toad. They confront Chris. Chris is not the toad licker. Meg is involved. This detail is important because it reframes the stakes. Meg is not licking the toad herself. She is holding it for one of the popular girls at school carrying the contraband as a kind of tribute, a bid for access to a social circle that has never had any interest in including her. She has not used the drug. She has been near it, in proximity to it, because proximity to the drug means proximity to the people who have made the drug socially meaningful, and proximity to those people is the only currency she currently has to offer. This is the show, in its second season, demonstrating a more nuanced understanding of how drug use spreads among teenagers than most drug education materials manage in their entire run. The toads themselves are almost incidental. What is operating in the high school is a social economy in which a particular substance has been assigned a position of prestige, and the students are responding not to the pharmacological appeal of the substance, but to the social logic of who has it and who does not. Meg does not want to get high. Meg wants to be inside the circle that has decided getting high is what cool people do. Peter's solution to this problem is, characteristically, unorthodox. He contacts the school principal and arrives the following morning as a new transfer student. Lando Griffin, cool kid, mysterious past, unlimited social authority. He constructs the name by glancing at random objects around the office, a pea, a tear running down someone's face, a decorative griffin, and in the chaos of the moment apparently forgets that his actual name is already Peter Griffin, a fact which the show milks for a brief but excellent moment of alarm. The episode does something interesting with the undercover sequence that follows. Peter as Lando is immediately and inexplicably popular. He smashes his hand on a cafeteria jukebox in a gesture that the assembled student body reads as effortlessly cool, and from that moment forward he is the person everyone wants to be near. The toads have not gone anywhere. The craze has not been addressed yet, but the arrival of someone who commands social attention with apparent ease creates a gravitational field that pulls the student population's focus toward him and away from the amphibians. When Lando declares, from his position of newly acquired social authority, that licking toads is over, that it is a thing that cool people have moved past, the craze collapses almost immediately. The toad-licking epidemic, which the news coverage had treated as a serious civic crisis, evaporates the moment the social logic that sustained it is withdrawn. This is the show's argument in miniature. The drugs were never really the point. The belonging was the point. The substance was the vehicle through which belonging was communicated, and the moment the communication changed, the substance became irrelevant. This is a more sophisticated argument about drug culture than most television comedies of 2000 were making, and Family Guy makes it inside a story that is ostensibly about a desk going undercover as a cool kid, which is a premise you could imagine producing something much more stupid than this episode actually produces. The complication arrives when Lando's mission is complete. He has done the thing he came to do. The toads are no longer culturally relevant. The kids have moved on. He should go home and be Peter Griffin again. Instead, Connie D'Amico, the most popular girl in the school, the kind of social apex predator whose attention transforms whoever receives it, asks Lando to the winter snowball, and Peter says yes. He had already promised Meg he would go with her. He breaks that promise without much visible internal struggle, and the show is clear that this is a moral failure, not just a comedic beat. Peter has found something he has never had before, the experience of being the person that the most desirable people in a room want to be near. This is its own form of intoxication. The social capital that the undercover identity affords him is genuinely addictive in the way that status almost always is. It produces a feeling of aliveness and significance that his ordinary life does not offer, and he reaches for it at the expense of the person he was supposed to be protecting. Meg arrives at the snowball alone. She is a teenage girl who has been watching her father be inexplicably popular at her own school for several days, and who had a tentative agreement that she would at least get to arrive at the dance with someone, and that someone has instead gone with the girl who has always been Meg's social nemesis. The episode does not play this as a throwaway beat. It sits in the disappointment for a moment. It lets Meg be hurt. Peter's resolution to the situation is characteristically improbable and characteristically generous in its way. Standing at the microphone with Connie, having just been crowned king of the snowball, he tells the assembled school that Meg was his first choice all along, that Lando had been pursuing Meg, that she had broken his heart by turning him down, and that everything that followed was a consequence of that heartbreak. It is a complete fabrication. But it reroutes the social narrative in Meg's direction, and the episode ends with Meg surrounded by sympathetic attention she did not earn through any particular merit, but which arrives anyway, as a form of parental guilt turned into a gift. Lando Griffin drives off into the night and is later reported to have died in a motorcycle accident. No body was found. The school yearbook is dedicated to him. The episode is a portrait of social addiction, of the specific human hunger for status and belonging that makes drug trends possible in the first place, and it handles the portrait with more care and precision than you might expect from a show that is primarily structured around jokes. The toad licking is a symptom of a social need. Peter's undercover adventure becomes its own expression of a social need. Even his failure to go to the dance with Meg is a product of social need, of the irresistible pull of being, for the first time in his life, the person that everyone wanted to be near. The show understands, in this episode, that the most powerful addictions are not pharmacological, they are relational. They are about how a particular thing makes you feel inside a specific social context and what you will do or fail to do in order to preserve that feeling. The toads are just frogs, in the end. The thing people were actually licking them for was each other. Section 3. Brian's Cocaine Spiral. The Thin White Line, Season 3. Season 3 of Family Guy, produced in 2000 and aired across the summer of 2001 after the show had already been canceled once and was on its way to a second cancellation, begins with the single most ambitious episode the show had attempted to that point. It is called The Thin White Line, and it is the story of how Brian Griffin, the most put-together member of a household that sets a relatively low bar for togetherness, falls apart completely over the course of a single episode. The title combines two things: the thin blue line, which is a colloquial term for law enforcement, and white lines, which is a well-established piece of slang for cocaine. Both of these things are going to be relevant. The episode is aware of its pun and does not try to hide it. Brian has been feeling flat. This is where the episode begins, and it is important to understand precisely what flat means in Brian's case, because he is not a character whose emotional register is typically dramatic. He is the dry one, the sardonic one, the one who watches things happen and comments on them with elegant precision. His baseline is a kind of calm, slightly world-weary intelligence, and his good days and his bad days exist within a relatively narrow band of visible affect. So when Brian tells his therapist that he is in an emotional rut, that things feel somehow less than they used to, that the pleasures and the routines of his life at Spooner Street have gone a little flat, it does not look like a crisis. It looks like a Tuesday. His therapist, Dr. Bruce Kaplan, suggests volunteer work. This is not a profound prescription. It is the kind of practical, sensible advice that therapists sometimes offer when the problem is one of direction rather than pathology. Go do something for someone else. Stop being so inwardly focused. Let the momentum of being useful carry you somewhere new. Brian agrees, somewhat reluctantly, and the episode spends a brief montage showing him trying various forms of community service. None of them quite fit. He is competent at them, but competence is different from purpose, and purpose is what he is actually looking for. The turning point arrives through Joe Swanson. Joe, the police officer who lives across the street and who has been Peter's friend for as long as the show has been running, has a professional need. The Quahog Police Department wants a drug-sniffing dog for work at the airport and other transit locations. Brian's nose, which, because he is a dog, is a considerably more sophisticated instrument than anything the show has previously asked it to do, is, Joe correctly suspects, exceptional. Brian takes the job. He is immediately and thoroughly excellent at it. His first day at the airport involves him moving through the crowded terminal, applying his nose to luggage and passengers and cargo with the casual efficiency of someone discovering that a skill they have always had is actually far more valuable than they knew. He finds suitcases containing cocaine, heroin, prescription medications being trafficked illegally. He makes the work look easy, because for him it genuinely is easy. But during the process of identifying a suitcase of cocaine during the act of doing his job correctly and well, he inhales some of the substance. Not intentionally, not recklessly, as the incidental consequence of being extremely good at detecting exactly this kind of thing. The cocaine enters his system as the byproduct of his competence, and this detail matters more than it might initially appear. The show is making a specific point. The first contact was not a choice. The moral accounting of what follows is more complex because of this. What follows is a period that the episode handles with a combination of visual comedy and genuine unease. Brian continues working. He is still excellent at the job. He is still catching smugglers, still performing the role that has given him a sense of purpose he has been missing. But he is also, with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety, using cocaine on his own time. The show charts this through his affect. The bright eyes that do not quite dim between shifts, the accelerated speech, the way the martini at the end of the day sits differently than it used to, because the day itself sits differently now. Seth MacFarlane's voice performance during Brian's high sequences in this episode is one of the things that makes the episode worth returning to. Brian is still Brian. The vocabulary is intact, the syntax is intact, the intelligence is still operating, but everything has been turned up past the point where it looks like health. He is too articulate, too energized, too confident. The sophistication that was always one of Brian's most attractive qualities has curdled into something that makes everyone in the room slightly uncomfortable, and the discomfort builds across the scenes in a way that the comedy cannot entirely absorb. The family intervention is staged in the living room. Brian arrives home visibly impaired, and the family has gathered because the family has noticed, even if they have not precisely articulated what they have noticed. The staging of the scene is interesting. Peter is there, and Lois is there, and Stewie is there in the background with his particular expression of detached amusement, and what happens inside it is more honest than the show usually permitted itself to be in these early seasons. Brian does not perform denial. He does not rage at the intervention or refuse the premise. He sits in the middle of the circle that his family has formed around him, and he breaks down. The emotion is specific and convincing, not the general expression of being caught, but the particular devastation of someone who has been maintaining a performance under enormous effort and has finally been given permission to stop. He is sorry. He knows he needs help. He asks for it. This moment is the one that earns the episode its place in the show's history. Family Guy in 2001 was not a show that had established itself as capable of emotional sincerity. It was the show with the random gags, the show that had just survived one cancellation and would not survive a second. And here is Brian Griffin sitting in his living room crying, and the show does not deflect from that with a joke. It holds the moment for as long as the moment needs to be held. He goes to the Providence Rehab Clinic. This is where the episode's B-story Peter's involvement begins in earnest, and the B-story functions as a kind of comic pressure valve that allows the episode to be serious about Brian without becoming relentlessly grim about it. Peter had won a cruise vacation through the company picnic, a week of leisure on the ocean that he had been looking forward to with the specific enthusiasm Peter brings to things he has not yet experienced and therefore imagines will be perfect. The cruise is canceled because the vacation money has to go toward Brian's rehabilitation instead. Peter discovers that the rehab facility has a pool. It has nice rooms. The amenities, assessed from the outside, are comparable to a resort. Peter fakes an addiction in order to check himself in. This is the kind of choice that should be catastrophic for an episode trying to take addiction seriously, and the fact that it is not catastrophic is a testament to how well the show managed its tonal gears in these early seasons. The comedy of Peter at the rehab clinic is broad and unsubtle. He is clearly not an addict. He does not understand the recovery program he has enrolled himself in, and his presence disrupts the clinic's functioning in ways that are played entirely for laughs. None of this undercuts Brian's arc, because the show is careful to keep them separate. When the scene is about Brian, the tone is one thing. When the scene is about Peter, the tone is something else entirely. The editing maintains the distinction. The disruption that Peter causes eventually accumulates to the point where the clinic's head doctor feels compelled to intervene. The doctor's assessment is that Peter is the destabilizing influence in Brian's life, the X factor. As he puts it, the presence that pushes Brian toward excess rather than toward moderation. He wants Brian to understand that his environment is part of his problem. Brian's rejection of this argument is one of the episode's most quietly significant moments. He pushes back clearly and specifically. No one made him continue using the cocaine after the initial accidental exposure. That choice was his. He owns it. The environmental factors are real, but they are not the whole story. And they are certainly not the part of the story that Brian is willing to outsource his accountability over. He made the choices he made. He is going to carry them. He and Peter leave the clinic together, which is technically a failure of treatment but is presented as something more ambiguous, as a decision that Brian has made with open eyes rather than a relapse in the clinical sense. And then, back at home, surrounded by his family, Brian announces the thing that the cocaine and the rehab and the entire episode have been leading toward. He is leaving. The experience of confronting what had been hollow in his life, of understanding why he reached for the cocaine in the first place, has made it impossible for him to stay. He cannot find what he is looking for on Spooner Street. He does not know where he will find it, but he needs to go look. He gets in a taxi. The family watches from the sidewalk. Stewie runs after the cab, calling Brian's name, and the camera holds on the receding vehicle for long enough to feel something before the "to be continued" title card appears. The thin white line established something that the show would build on for the next 20 years. That Brian Griffin's relationship with substances is not decorative. It is load-bearing. The drinking, the occasional drug use, the bottle in the safety deposit box, these are not background details. They are the expression of a specific hunger in a specific character, and the show would keep returning to that hunger because it never found a resolution for it. The cocaine episode ended. The hunger did not end. It just went back underground and waited. Section 4. Stewie's first taste. Alcohol and the architecture of control. To understand Stewie Griffin's relationship with alcohol, you need to understand something about what alcohol does for a specific kind of person, or, in this case, a specific kind of genius baby that almost nothing else can do. Stewie's defining characteristic, across every version of the character, across every season of the show, is control. He is an organism devoted entirely to the management of outcomes. His bedroom contains weapons of remarkable sophistication. His schemes are multi-step, multi-variable, contingency planned. He speaks in complete sentences at the age of 1 because incomplete sentences represent a failure of precision. He does not let things happen to him if he can engineer a way to make them happen differently. The things he cannot control are the things that undone him. And this is why alcohol has such a specific and recurring pull for Stewie across the various instances in the show where he encounters it. Because alcohol does something to the controlling mind that the controlling mind cannot entirely prepare for. It loosens. It removes the scaffolding. It creates, briefly, a state of consciousness in which the agenda setting, the outcome management, the constant calibration of cause and effect, all of that goes quiet, and what is left is something closer to just existing. For a character who never stops calculating, the idea of not calculating is intoxicating in a way that has almost nothing to do with the pharmacology of the substance. The earliest significant alcohol incident involving Stewie comes from Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, which was released as a direct-to-DVD film in September of 2005, assembled from 3 episode-length segments that were initially planned as part of Season 4 before Fox decided to package them for home video release. The first segment is called Stewie Be Good, and it contains the seed from which the show's later, more developed Stewie and alcohol stories would grow. The episode begins at a public swimming pool, which is exactly the kind of civilian setting that Stewie's presence immediately transforms into a potential site of violence. He is there with the family, which means he is ostensibly there to swim, which means he is ostensibly there in the way that 1-year-olds are brought to swimming pools, to splash around in a supervised, age-appropriate manner and develop the motor skills associated with basic aquatic navigation. What Stewie is actually there for is to eliminate Brad. Brad is another child at the swimming pool who is, objectively, a better swimmer than Stewie, and in the specific moral geography of Stewie Griffin's mind, excellence in any domain that Stewie has not yet mastered represents an existential threat. The response to an existential threat is not to practice your backstroke. The response is to lure the threat with a piece of marzipan to a lifeguard tower that has been wired with explosives and then detonate the tower with the threat still inside it. The plan fails, as Stewie's plans always fail in these early seasons. The detonator mechanism is delayed. Brad eats the marzipan and leaves the blast radius before the explosives trigger. The tower comes down on Stewie instead. He dies. Briefly, the episode takes him to hell, which turns out to be a hotel room with a somewhat sinister welcome sign and Steve Allen making an unwanted appearance. And then he comes back to life at the pool, shaken by the experience in a way that the villain version of Stewie is not usually shaken by anything. The near-death experience produces in Stewie a genuine, if temporary, desire to change. He resolves to be kinder. He decides to stop plotting against people. He is, for the first time in the show's history, trying to be something other than the evil genius And the show is interested in what that attempt looks like for a character whose entire architecture is built around the evil genius identity. It looks, among other things, like struggle. Stewie finds kindness extremely difficult. Every instinct he has runs counter to it. Every interaction he has is contaminated by the reflex toward manipulation or superiority, or the casual cruelty of someone who has always treated other people as obstacles or instruments. Being nice requires constant active effort in a way that being villainous never did. Brian, observing all of this with the benevolent concern that characterizes his relationship with Stewie in this period, offers advice. He drinks martinis, he explains, because they help him be more social. They take the edge off the slightly abrasive quality of existing in a world that has not quite accommodated itself to your particular combination of intelligence and dissatisfaction. A drink loosens things. It helps. Stewie wants a drink. Brian does not give him one. There are limits, even for Brian, and handing a martini to an infant exceeds them. But once Brian leaves the room, Stewie pours himself a glass, and then another. His response to the alcohol is total and immediate. The intelligence does not leave Stewie drunk, still uses the same vocabulary and the same sentence structures as Stewie sober, but the intelligence is now running without its usual breaks. He says things that the sober Stewie would have kept internal. He makes decisions that the sober Stewie would have examined from multiple angles before rejecting. He laughs, which is not something the early Stewie did with any frequency or spontaneity. The loosening is visible in every scene he is in for the rest of the night. Brian's plan to cure the fascination 5 martinis at the Drunken Clam, a genuine hangover the following morning, the aversion therapy of experiencing the full arc of the thing, rather than just the pleasant early portion of it, is the kind of plan that a person with a healthy relationship to alcohol might design, and a person with a problematic relationship to alcohol almost certainly would design. It treats the problem as one of insufficient experience. Stewie thinks he wants to drink because he has not yet experienced what drinking actually produces in its later stages. Give him the later stages. That will fix it. It does fix it, in the short term. Stewie wakes up the following morning with a hangover that the episode depicts with surprising specificity: the light that is too bright, the stomach that has opinions, the head that has become somehow both heavier and more fragile overnight, and decides, with considerable conviction, that he never wants to be anywhere near a martini glass ever again. The fix does not last, of course. The show is not built for fixes that last. But Stewie B. Good plants something important. The idea that for Stewie Griffin, alcohol's primary appeal is not the taste or the social ritual or any of the other things that people usually describe when they explain why they drink. Its appeal is the specific and profound rest it offers to a mind that never, under normal circumstances, stops. The evil genius is always working. The drunk baby can just exist. This is the kind of thing that the show would deepen considerably in later seasons, in the cough syrup episode and in the various moments where Stewie's relationship with his own need for control becomes visible in new ways. But Stewie B. Good is where it begins, and it is worth sitting with because it says something precise about why the character keeps returning to alcohol across the show's long run. He is not looking for oblivion. He is looking for a break from himself. And alcohol, however briefly and however expensively in terms of what comes after, is the only thing that has ever reliably provided one. Section 5 Peter and the Burger Obsession, McStroke, and the Compulsion to Consume. Season 6 of Family Guy, which aired across the 2007 to 2008 broadcast year, was a season in transition. The show was working through the character changes that had been building since the revival in 2005. The animation was in the hands of a studio called Digital Emotion, whose style was noticeably stiffer than the earlier look, and the Writers Guild of America strike that hit Hollywood in November of 2007 disrupted the back half of the season's production schedule significantly. In the middle of all of this creative turbulence, the 13th episode of the season, McStroke, which originally aired on January 13th of 2008, produced one of the more pointed and more uncomfortable pieces of commentary about compulsive eating and the food industry that the show ever attempted. The episode begins with a mustache. Peter grows one, which transforms his appearance enough that people who do not know him well look at him differently. He looks, accidentally, like someone in an authoritative profession, This is the setup for everything that follows, and the show establishes it quickly and with the efficiency of a story that knows exactly where it is going. Peter is at a McBurgertown, the show's generic fast food chain, built in the recognizable image of McDonald's, with just enough fictional distance to avoid legal complications when a grease fire breaks out in the kitchen. The staff panics. Peter, who happens to be near the counter, and who looks, because of the mustache, like a firefighter or some other kind of official person capable of managing an emergency, responds to the situation in a way that is vaguely helpful. The details of what he actually does are less important than the outcome. The owner of the McBurgertown location, awash in gratitude, offers Peter an unlimited lifetime supply of burgers at any of their locations. Anytime, any quantity, no charge, forever. What Peter does with this gift is the episode's central joke, and also its central argument, and the two things are the same thing. He goes to McBurgertown and eats 30 hamburgers in a single sitting. The number 30 is chosen with precision. It is not an amount anyone would eat in an ordinary expression of hunger. It is not even an amount someone would eat in an ordinary expression of indulgence, the kind where you have a second or a third helping because the food is good and you are enjoying the company and the evening is going well. 30 hamburgers is the amount of burgers a person eats when they are no longer eating because they are hungry, or because the burgers taste good, or because eating is pleasurable. 30 burgers is what someone eats when the eating has become something else entirely, when the goal is to maximize the consumption rather than to satisfy the appetite, when the removal of external limits has created a vacuum that the person is filling with food in the same way you might fill a hole with whatever is nearby. Peter has always had this quality, the inability to identify when enough has been reached, but the unlimited McBurgertown access creates an environment in which the quality can express itself without the usual external check of cost or availability or the social constraint of being observed doing something obviously excessive. He is alone with the burgers, and the burgers are infinite, and he eats 30 of them. He suffers a stroke. The episode does not soften this. The left side of Peter's body is paralyzed. His face droops. His arm hangs. His leg drags. His speech is a wet, labored approximation of his usual voice, every word costing visible effort to produce. The visual of Peter's partially paralyzed face is played with a specificity that is uncomfortable in a way the show rarely aimed for. It looks like a stroke looks, rather than like a cartoon's idea of what a stroke looks like, and the discomfort this produces is part of the episode's point. This condition persists for 3 months, which the episode conveys through a montage. 3 months of Peter walking with the drag, speaking with the impairment, being the version of himself that 30 hamburgers produced. The show allows this to last long enough to feel real in the way that consequences rarely feel real in the Family Guy universe. The reset button is coming, it always comes, but the episode makes you wait for it in a way that serves the story. The recovery arrives via a stem cell research facility, where a 5-minute session reverses the physical damage completely. Peter walks out looking exactly as he did before the stroke. This is played as a miracle, and it is also played as a piece of political commentary. The technology that healed Peter is precisely the technology that American political debates of the mid-2000s had placed under significant regulatory and legislative scrutiny. The implication that a cure for something devastating has been sitting there waiting, while the argument about whether to allow it continued is delivered without being belabored. The show makes the point and moves on. But the more interesting part of McStroke is what happens after the recovery. Peter does not simply return to his pre-stroke life, grateful and chastened. He develops a new obsession, and the new obsession is the campaign to dismantle McBurgertown for what it did to him. This is the episode's observation about how compulsion works when the original compulsive behavior has become unavailable. The energy does not dissipate. It transfers. Peter was obsessive about eating the burgers. Now he is obsessive about the burger's accountability. The shape is different, but the intensity is identical. He stands outside McBurgertown locations with a sign. He gives speeches. He confronts corporate representatives with the specific kind of self-righteous fury that Peter Griffin deploys when he has been personally wronged and has decided that the wrong deserves a campaign rather than a conversation. The energy is real and the cause is not entirely unjust. The fast food industry's relationship with public health is a legitimate subject for scrutiny, but the show is careful to depict Peter's crusade as emerging. from wounded pride and personal grievance rather than from any principle. He is not doing this because he has thought carefully about the systemic pressures that the fast food industry creates around eating habits. He is doing it because they made him eat 30 burgers, which is, to be accurate, a thing he did entirely to himself. The episode's B-plot involves Brian growing a mustache to replicate Peter's accidental authority and discovering that the mustache repositions him socially in ways that are completely different from how it repositioned Peter. Where Peter's mustache read as firefighter, Brian's reads as something else entirely. The mustache plot is farcical and largely separate from the food compulsion storyline, but it comments on the same theme from a different angle. The way an external detail a single piece of the presentation can restructure how the world reads you, and how identity is more constructed and more fragile than it usually looks. What McStroke adds to the show's addiction catalog is a specific portrait of food compulsion that the show handles with more honesty than it usually extends to subjects that intersect with Peter's physical size. The show had, in earlier and later seasons, made Peter's weight a source of comedy that did not always engage seriously with what it meant. McStroke is different. It puts a physical consequence on the kind of eating that has always characterized Peter, and it makes that consequence visible and persistent enough to be uncomfortable. The stroke is not a funny consequence. It is a real one, given the cartoon treatment, but real enough that the episode is saying something with it rather than just using it as a setup. The something it is saying is not complicated. Some hungers, if you remove the external constraints that normally regulate them, will simply keep going until they cause damage. The external constraint on Peter's burger eating was the cost. Remove the cost and you learn something about what the hunger actually is when nothing is checking it. 30 burgers is what it is. And the damage that 30 burgers causes, in a person whose particular physiology and particular relationship with consumption are what Peter's are, is a stroke. He recovers completely and goes back to eating. The pattern does not break. It never quite breaks. The show understands this, even if it does not always want to linger in that understanding for longer than an episode. Section 6. The Surfin' Bird Fixation. I Dream of Jesus, Season 7. The 7th season of Family Guy premiered in the autumn of 2008 and contained in its second episode one of the most thorough portraits of obsessive compulsion, the non-pharmacological kind, the kind that lives inside a particular idea or sound or feeling, and refuses to leave that the show ever produced. The episode is called I Dream of Jesus, and for the first half of its runtime, it is almost entirely about Peter Griffin's inability to stop playing a record. The record is Surfin' Bird by the Trashmen. This is a real song. It was released in 1963, assembled by the band from elements of two earlier novelty tracks, The Bird's the Word by the Rivingtons and Papa Momo, also by the Rivingtons, and it operates at the intersection of rockabilly energy and something approaching avant-garde noise, structured around the repeated assertion that the bird is, was, and presumably will continue to be the word, delivered with an intensity that makes the statement feel urgent, even though the statement itself resists any straightforward parsing. It is, by any reasonable measure, a profoundly silly piece of music. It is also, in the specific register of something that lodges in your auditory memory and refuses to leave, extraordinarily effective. Peter discovers it at the Nifty 50s Diner, a theme restaurant the family visits that has among its amenities an old-fashioned jukebox. He puts his hand on the jukebox selections and the first notes of Surfin' Bird emerge, and what happens to Peter's face in that moment is something the show depicts with a specificity that is almost unfair in how accurate it is. His pupils widen. His expression transitions from the ambient mild vacancy, that is Peter Griffin's resting state, into something that looks genuinely and without irony, like rapture. He has heard this song before. The episode implies a prior encounter somewhere in his past, but rediscovering it in the diner, at this moment, produces in him the specific species of musical joy that only a very particular kind of song can produce in a very particular kind of person. He tells Brian, "You haven't heard the greatest song ever written." Brian is skeptical. Peter plays him the song. Brian is not converted. This is the beginning of a dynamic that the episode sustains across its first half with impressive commitment. Peter's campaign to share the song to produce in the people around him, the feeling that the song produces in him, runs directly into the reality that other people are not Peter, and that a song which produces rapture in Peter Griffin produces in Brian Griffin something closer to the desire to be elsewhere. The gap between Peter's experience of the song and everyone else's experience of it is not closable. There is no argument that bridges it. The only thing that could produce in Brian what the song produces in Peter is being Peter, and that is not available. Peter plays the song at dinner. He plays it late at night when the family is trying to sleep. He produces a television public service announcement filmed and broadcast on the local channel, explaining to the residents of the town that the bird is the word and has always been the word, and that the failure to recognize this is something he feels strongly needs to be corrected. He carries the record into rooms where the people present were not thinking about music at all, and plays it into those rooms and waits for a response that does not come. The comedy of this extended sequence is built on length and commitment in a way that Family Guy did not always have the confidence to pursue. The first time Peter plays the song in a new context, it is funny because it is unexpected. The second time, it is funny because the show is committed enough to do it again. By the fifth time, it has crossed into something that functions differently from the standard gag structure. It is funny in the way that a very specific kind of absurdist endurance comedy is funny, where the joke has moved past the punchline and into a territory where the continued existence of the joke is itself the joke. The song keeps playing. Peter keeps playing it. The family keeps reacting. The repetition is the point. Brian destroys the record at one point. He takes it and breaks it and disposes of it with the certainty of a person who believes that removing the object will remove the compulsion. He is wrong. Peter finds another copy within what appears to be a very short time. He will always find another copy. The thing about vinyl records as a technology is that they were mass-produced in quantities that make them essentially impossible to fully eliminate. And the thing about Surfin' Bird is that it was popular enough at the time of its release to have been pressed in quantities that ensure its continued availability in secondhand shops and the back catalogs of collectors. Peter's access to the song is, for all practical purposes, unlimited. What the show is doing in this extended sequence, and it is worth being specific about this because the episode sometimes gets described as simply being a long joke about an annoying song, is depicting the particular quality of obsession that does not operate through reason. Peter is not playing the song because he has considered the arguments for and against playing it, and concluded that the arguments for outweigh the arguments against. He is playing it because not playing it is not something he is currently capable of. The song has installed itself in him in a place that reasoning does not reach. You cannot argue him out of it. You cannot break the record hard enough. The thing lives in him now, and it will come out when it comes out. This is the structure of compulsion at its most fundamental, and the show depicts it through something as innocuous as a song, precisely because the innocuousness is part of the point. The object of compulsion does not have to be dangerous to be compulsive. It does not have to be a substance or a behavior that causes measurable harm. It can be a Trashman record from 1963. The mechanism is the same regardless of the object. The second half of the episode pivots into a storyline about Jesus Christ, who Peter discovers working at a local record store. He recognizes Jesus, befriends Jesus, introduces Jesus back into the public eye, and Jesus becomes famous in the modern sense talk shows, paparazzi, the full apparatus of contemporary celebrity culture applied to a figure whose entire message was predicated on rejecting exactly this kind of attention. The satire is quick and fairly sharp. Celebrity culture absorbs everything it touches and converts it into content, and it does this to Jesus with the same efficiency it would apply to anyone else. The connection between the two halves of the episode is the theme of something that was meant to be experienced in a specific way being extracted from that context and exposed to forces that transform it. The song is meant to be discovered, held close, shared with people who will love it the way you love it. Peter's mistake is believing he can manufacture the conditions for that love in other people by playing the song louder or more frequently. Jesus's mistake is believing that the message survives the machinery of public attention. Both halves of the story are about the gap between the experience of a thing and the transmission of that experience. The episode ends with the song still playing, more or less. Peter's fixation with Surfin' Bird does not resolve into a scene of him putting the record down and deciding he has heard it enough. The show does not offer that resolution because the show understands that compulsion does not tend to work that way. The thing does not end when you have had enough of it. It ends when it ends, on its own schedule, according to internal dynamics that the person experiencing it does not entirely control. For a brief period in the autumn of 2008, Peter Griffin could not stop playing Surfin' Bird, and the episode about this is one of the more honest things the show ever produced, about how a compulsive fixation actually feels from the inside, not pathological, not dramatic, not the stuff of interventions and clinical diagnoses, just a song that got into him and could not find its way back out. Section 7. Brian, the Weed, and the Town That Went Somewhere Different. Episode 420, Season 7. The 12th episode of Season 7 of Family Guy aired on the 19th of April, 2009, one day before the date celebrated in cannabis culture, and the timing was not accidental. The episode is called 420, and it is the show's most sustained engagement with marijuana as a subject, structured not as a cautionary tale or an addiction story in the conventional sense, but as something more unusual. A piece of advocacy comedy that uses the characters and the format of Family Guy to argue a position about drug policy, and does it with more craft and more clarity than the show usually brought to its politically motivated episodes. The story begins not with Brian but with Peter and a cat. Peter and his friends Quagmire, Cleveland, Joe have been increasingly frustrated by the amount of time Quagmire spends with a stray cat he has taken in and named James. This is a subtle but real disruption to the social ecosystem of the friend group. Quagmire, who has always been the most reliably available member of the Drunken Clam cohort, has developed an attachment to an animal, and the attachment has made him gentler, more domestic, less interested in the evenings of directionless socializing that the group considers its primary activity. The friends decide to shave the cat as a prank. Peter, performing this task, accidentally kills the cat with a razor. This is played as horrifying in exactly the way the show plays things that are horrifying briefly, directly, without dwelling, moving immediately to the logistical problem of what to do now that the cat is dead. Peter and Brian take the cat's body into the woods to dispose of it. They are driving back when they are pulled over by the police. Here is where the episode reveals its real subject. The police officer who pulls them over discovers, in Brian's possession, a small amount of marijuana. The dead cat in the back of the car is not mentioned. The dead cat does not constitute, apparently, a law enforcement priority. The marijuana, however, is cause for arrest. This juxtaposition, killing a cat with a razor, no consequences. Possessing marijuana, immediate legal intervention, is the episode's political argument compressed into a single scene. The show is making a point about proportionality in drug enforcement, about the specific way that marijuana has been treated as a more pressing concern than many forms of actual harm, and it makes the point through the specific Family Guy mechanism of putting the absurdity on screen and letting the audience sit with it. Brian is arrested. He is bailed out by the family. He is placed on probation and informed that he will be subject to periodic drug testing. He begins smoking marijuana again almost immediately after his release, which is depicted as a choice the show neither endorses nor condemns but simply presents as what Brian does. Joe arrives for a drug test. Brian attempts to substitute Stewie's urine for his own. Lois catches him. Lois tells him that if he is willing to go this far to continue smoking marijuana, it is time for him to change. Brian's response is to change, but not in the direction Lois means. Instead of stopping, he launches a campaign to legalize marijuana in the town. He and Stewie write a song called A Bag of Weed, performed to the tune of Me Ol' Bamboo from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which catalogs the benefits of legal marijuana access with the kind of theatrical enthusiasm that the show brought to its best musical numbers. The song is joyful and catchy and completely earnest in its advocacy, and its performance in the town square draws a crowd that is almost immediately persuaded. Mayor Adam West, who in the context of this show functions as a vehicle for whatever the plot needs civic authority to do, passes a law making marijuana legal in the town. The entire population except Lois, her father Carter, and the children begin smoking it. The episode then reports on the results. Crime decreases, productivity increases, community well-being improves measurably. The comedy is gentle, and the advocacy is real. Even Peter, thoroughly stoned in the episode's middle section, becomes too mellowed out to construct a cutaway gag. The show comments on its own format through the joke, the cutaway gag, the engine of the show's comedy for most of its run, is presented as something that requires a specific kind of anxious reach for anything energy, and that energy dissipates when Peter is adequately relaxed. The gag commentary is funny and also, in retrospect, somewhat revealing about how the writers thought about their own comedic toolkit. Carter Pewterschmidt's objection to the legalization is financial rather than moral. He is losing money in the timber industry because hemp, now legal to grow and use commercially, has begun replacing wood pulp in paper production. He enlists Peter to make a series of anti-marijuana videos which fail entirely because Peter lacks the passionate conviction that made Brian's campaign work. Lois observes this and articulates the lesson. Brian succeeded because he actually believed in what he was saying. You cannot fake the passion. Carter then approaches Brian directly. He offers to publish Brian's novel, the long-gestating, never-quite-finished work that has been Brian's source of shame and aspiration across the show's entire run, with an Oprah's book club endorsement, which in 2009 was essentially a guarantee of enormous commercial success. In exchange, Brian reverses his position, makes marijuana illegal again, and the town goes back to the way it was. Brian's book comes out, it sells 0 copies. Out of a 2 million copy print run, the reviews are categorical in their negativity. Tom Tucker reports on the failure as a genuine news story, noting that Brian's novel has set a record as the worst-selling book in American publishing history. This ending is the episode at its most honest and also at its most pointed. Brian compromised the thing he actually believed for a personal benefit that never materialized. The cause he sold is now worse off than it was before he got involved, because the legalization he championed has been reversed through his own agency. He is not a victim of the outcome he is, its author. He took the deal and the deal did not pay out, and the thing he traded away is gone. The episode generated genuine international consequences that remain notable more than 15 years after its broadcast. The Venezuelan government banned Family Guy from its national networks following the episode's airing. Justice Minister Tarek El Aissami publicly characterized the Bag of Weed song as an example of American media promoting drug use to undermine Latin American narcotics policy. The cable station that had been airing the show replaced the banned episode with an episode of Baywatch and broadcast public service announcements as an apology. President Chavez's administration threatened financial penalties for networks that continued to air the show. Brian Griffin was named Stoner of the Year by High Times magazine for 2009, becoming the first animated character to receive the honor. The episode's relationship to addiction in the conventional sense is oblique. Brian's marijuana use is not presented as a dependency in the way that his cocaine use in Season 3 was presented. He is a user who reaches for the substance as a regular part of his life, without visible escalation or loss of control. The episode's concern is not whether Brian's relationship with marijuana is healthy, but whether the legal framework around marijuana is proportionate and just. These are different questions, and the show was clear about which one it was asking. Section 8. Peter Faces the Bottle. Friends of Peter G. Season 9. The 10th episode of Season 9 of Family Guy is titled Friends of Peter G., a reference to the Alcoholics Anonymous tradition of members referring to each other as Friends of Bill W. in social situations where they do not wish to announce their affiliation directly. The episode aired on the 13th of February, 2011, and it is, by a significant margin, the most emotionally serious episode the show produced about alcohol in its entire run, and arguably one of the most emotionally serious episodes it produced about anything. The episode begins with Peter and Brian at a movie theater, which establishes several things at once: that they are together, that they are drinking, and that their drinking in a public setting has already reached the point where it is going to attract the attention of law enforcement. The exact sequence of events at the theater is less important than the outcome. They are disruptive enough that Joe Swanson, summoned on a noise complaint, has to respond. Peter and Brian are subsequently sentenced by the court to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. Both of them resist this, but they resist it differently, and the difference is revealing. Peter resists in the way Peter resists most things, without much philosophical framework, primarily because he does not want to do something that has been imposed on him by an external authority, and because he does not see his drinking as a problem that requires a solution. Peter Griffin's self-awareness is not a strong feature of his personality in any domain, and his ability to examine his relationship with alcohol is no exception. Brian's resistance is more interesting because it is more articulate. Brian has arguments against AA, He says that the program functions by replacing one dependency with another, that people who attend regularly become as compulsively attached to the meetings and the structure of the program as they ever were to drinking, which means the underlying issue, the compulsive attachment itself, is never actually addressed. He says that social pressure and peer expectation within AA create a kind of groupthink that is epistemically problematic. He is in the mode of Brian Griffin at his most annoying, making a case. The case is not entirely without merit. These criticisms of AA exist in the real world, in the academic literature on addiction treatment, in the arguments made by people who believe that the program's emphasis on powerlessness and higher power is more limiting than empowering. Brian is not wrong about all of this. He is also, almost certainly, making these arguments primarily because he does not want to stop drinking, and dressing that reluctance in the vocabulary of philosophical objection is considerably easier than admitting it directly. The AA meetings themselves are drawn with more warmth and specificity than you might expect from a show that was not always generous to its supporting characters. Bruce is there the soft-voiced, gentle, consistently patient figure who appears across many episodes in contexts that suggest he has had various troubles of his own. The other attendees are sketched in quickly but with enough detail to feel like people rather than set decoration. The community that exists within the meeting space is genuinely supportive of itself, and the show does not mock it. It finds comedy in what happens when Peter and Brian collide with the community, but the community itself is drawn respectfully. Peter's response to the program is to bring several cases of beer to the second meeting. This is not malicious. Peter genuinely believes that the recovering alcoholics in the room would be happier if they had access to alcohol, because Peter would be happier if he had access to alcohol, and Peter's model of other people is essentially himself, with slightly different personal details. He is wrong in a way that causes genuine harm. The episode is clear that what he does is wrong, that it disrupts the progress of people who have been working hard to maintain their sobriety, but he is not wrong out of cruelty. He is wrong out of the particular kind of obtuseness that has always been Peter's defining characteristic, the inability to imagine that other people's relationship with a thing might be fundamentally different from his own. Bruce's response to the beer, the moment when the endless patient snaps, briefly and completely, is one of the episode's best character moments. Bruce does not often register strong emotion in any of his appearances across the show. He is the mild one, the understanding one, the one who responds to chaos with a gentle smile and a conciliatory tone. When he nearly loses his composure over the beer, the moment carries weight precisely because it is so out of character. It tells you something about what the program means to him, what maintaining sobriety has cost him, and what it feels like to have that work threatened by someone who does not understand what they are threatening. The central structural device of the episode, Death's intervention, the visions of the future, arrives after Peter drives home drunk from the AA meeting and crashes his car into a tree. Death, the recurring Family Guy character who operates in the universe as a mild, slightly put-upon cosmic employee, arrives to collect Peter and then, in what reads as either compassion or morbid curiosity, offers him a choice: see what your continued drinking produces, or see what never drinking would have produced. The first vision is the one the episode takes most seriously. Peter, continuing to drink as he currently drinks, arrives at a future in which everything the early seasons established about his character, the affection for his family, the underlying generosity, the bumbling warmth, has been consumed by the alcohol. He is abusive. He is absent in the ways that matter even when physically present. He is in an affair with Angela, his supervisor at the brewery, a relationship that is depicted as squalid and mutually degrading rather than in any way romantic. His children live in fear of him. His marriage has become a structure of mutual misery that neither party has the energy to escape. The episode does not play this vision for laughs. The violence in it is not funny in the way that violence in Family Guy usually tries to be funny. It is depicted with a flatness, an absence of comedic framing, that makes it land differently from the show's usual approach to dark content. This is what it looks like, the episode is saying. Not the cartoon version of what it looks like. The real version, rendered in animation. The second vision, Peter, without alcohol at all, having never drunk, is funnier, but funny in a way that serves the episode's point. This Peter is genuinely better in most measurable ways. More present, more patient, more sober, a more reliable husband and father. He drinks milk at the Drunken Clam with friends who are themselves perfectly sober. He has a slightly different voice, brighter, more earnest, that sounds uncannily like what Peter Griffin might have been if his entire personality had developed without the specific texture that alcohol gives it. Peter, watching this vision, does not want to be that person. Not because that person is worse by objective measures, the sober Peter is considerably better, but because that person is unrecognizable as Peter. The rough edges, the particular quality of chaos that Peter Griffin embodies, the way he moves through the world at high volume and low precision, these are inseparable from the drinking, or at least inseparable from the person the drinking has helped create. The sober Peter is someone else, and Peter does not want to be someone else. Death explains the lesson in terms that are, for Family Guy, surprisingly measured. Peter does not have to give up alcohol. The vision of sobriety was not presented as a paradise, it was presented as a different kind of loss. What Peter needs to do is drink less, not stop, moderate, find the amount that allows him to be himself without becoming the version of himself in the first vision. Peter agrees. He is resurrected. He begins buying six-packs and throwing 3 cans away before he starts drinking. It is a bizarre system. It is also, in the Peter Griffin framework, exactly the right system. It works with his psychology rather than against it. It acknowledges that moderation cannot be achieved by simply deciding to want less, and it produces the outcome of Peter drinking fewer beers per day through the mechanism of purchasing the same number and removing half before they can be consumed. The episode's final image, the seagulls at the landfill becoming extravagantly drunk on the discarded beer, is the show restoring levity to a story it has kept serious for longer than it usually manages. It is a good joke. It is also the episode acknowledging that even a story about learning moderation cannot end with something that looks like a moral, because Family Guy is not a show that ends on morals, even when it is being a show that earns one. Section 9, Stewie and the Cough Syrup. Baking Bad Season 13. Season 13 of Family Guy aired in 2014 and 2015, and its third episode, Baking Bad, which aired on October 19th of 2014, contains in its B-plot a story about Stewie Griffin and cough medicine that is smaller in scale than the show's other addiction stories, but more specific in its emotional precision than most of them. By the 13th season, Stewie is a substantially transformed character from the evil genius baby of the show's early years. The world domination plots are gone. The schemes to murder Lois have been retired. The Season 6 two-parter that functioned as a sort of goodbye to that version of the character Stewie finally achieving his goal, killing Lois, conquering the world, and then having the whole thing revealed as a computer simulation, was the show's way of acknowledging that they were closing that chapter. The Stewie who exists in Season 13 is primarily defined by his relationship with Brian, by his emotional life, and by the particular combination of intelligence and vulnerability that the writers had developed to replace the villainy. This Stewie is, in many ways, a more accessible character than the early one. He is capable of warmth, of genuine friendship, of the kind of loyalty that the evil genius version of the character would have regarded as a tactical weakness. He is also, because of those same qualities, capable of being hurt in ways the early Stewie was insulated against. The armor of sociopathy is gone. What is left is something softer, and the softness has its own exposures. The setup of the cough syrup story is genuinely sweet in a way that is unusual for Family Guy in this period. Stewie cannot sleep. This is the specific and somewhat unglamorous problem at the center of the subplot, not a scheme, not a conspiracy, not a plan of any kind. Just a baby lying in a crib in the dark who cannot find his way to sleep because the person who usually helps him doesn't. Lois tells him bedtime stories, has always told him bedtime stories, and Lois is out. Without the story, without the specific ritual of her presence and her voice, sleep will not come. The Sandman shows up. The Sandman does not help. He is, in the mythology of this particular episode, available as a resource but unable to bridge the specific gap that Lois's absence has created. Brian is the one who responds to the problem, and his response is genuinely well-intentioned, even as it is genuinely misguided. Prescription-strength cough medicine, he reasons, contains enough alcohol to help Stewie relax. A small amount would take the edge off the wakefulness. It is not ideal, he acknowledges while administering it, that it is really not meant for children, but it will work, and working tonight is what matters. The cough medicine works. It works comprehensively and immediately. Stewie falls asleep. The problem is solved. The problem returns the next morning in a different form. Stewie has had the cough medicine. Stewie liked the cough medicine. Stewie wants more cough medicine. Not because he cannot sleep the next morning, he is awake and apparently well rested, but because the cough medicine produced a specific quality of ease and looseness that nothing else in his current experience provides, and having experienced it, he wants to experience it again. This is the basic mechanics of compulsive behavior the Thing is encountered. The Thing produces a pleasant effect. The pleasant effect creates the appetite for repetition, and the episode depicts the progression with the swift efficiency of a B-plot that knows it has a limited amount of time to tell its story. Stewie begins using the cough medicine regularly. He begins using it at times and in quantities that exceed any plausible therapeutic justification. His behavior at the breakfast table becomes erratic in specific ways. The vocabulary remains intact, the sentence structures remain intact, but everything is running slightly sideways, slightly too warm, slightly more candid than the sober Stewie usually allows himself to be. Peter sits directly next to Stewie at the breakfast table during one of these sequences, eating his own breakfast in complete oblivion, while Stewie delivers a slurred and wandering monologue about a kebab he wants to order the specific alternating pattern of meat and vegetables that he requires, which he keeps losing track of and having to restart. The camera reveals Peter's presence gradually, the punchline being that the chaos next to him is entirely invisible to him. This is both a joke about Peter's obliviousness and a joke about how compulsive behavior can operate for a surprisingly long time in plain sight before anyone decides to name it. Stewie rides his big wheel while intoxicated. He collides with another child on the street. The child is hurt. Stewie, sitting on the ground after the collision, experiences something that the show depicts with care. The moment when the looseness that the substance provides encounters a real consequence, and the consequence is a child who is hurt because of a choice Stewie made. The gap between the pleasant quality of the impairment and the unpleasant reality of what the impairment produces is made visible in that moment. Brian arranges an intervention. The participants are Stewie's toys, the stuffed animals and action figures that populate the shelves of his room arranged in a circle around a chair where Stewie is directed to sit. The choice to use the toys rather than the family members as the intervention participants is both comic and precise. These are Stewie's companions in the specific space where the cough medicine use has been happening, the witnesses to the progression of the behavior, and their arrangement in an intervention circle says something about how completely the space has been colonized by the pattern. Brian names what has happened. He names the accident, specifically the child who was hurt, the big wheel, the extent to which Stewie was responsible for the hurt because he was impaired. This is the moment the episode has been building to, and what follows is quick but real. Stewie breaks. He looks at Brian and says that he does not have a cough, that his sinuses are completely clear, but that he has a problem. The admission is sandwiched between a medical observation that should be absurd and somehow is not, because the emotional content of what Stewie is saying is genuine even as the framing is comic. The show does not choose between the comedy and the honesty. It holds both. Brian helps him through the withdrawal and the recovery, which the episode handles in compressed time. The resolution comes relatively quickly, because the B-plot has limits, and the main plot about the cookie bakery also needs space. But the quickness of the resolution does not undercut what the story has established. That Stewie's relationship with the cough medicine was real while it lasted. That the thing it offered him was real, even if the medicine was not designed to offer it. And that the process of admitting the problem and asking for help was genuinely difficult for a character whose identity has always been organized around self-sufficiency and control. The detail that makes the Breaking Bad storyline more interesting than it might initially appear is what the cough medicine was actually providing. Stewie's stated problem at the beginning of the subplot is sleeplessness, but sleeplessness in Stewie's case is a specific kind of sleeplessness. It is the sleeplessness of a mind that does not know how to stop. Stewie is always thinking. The plans, the calculations, the assessments of every interaction and every outcome, these do not stop when the lights go out and the crib becomes the only space. They continue. And Lois's bedtime story, the specific, gentle, repetitive ritual of it, was one of the things that could reliably quiet them. Without the story, the mind keeps going. The cough medicine quieted the mind in a different way, a pharmacological way, a way that worked regardless of whether Lois was there. This is why Stewie wanted it again in the morning, when sleeplessness was no longer the immediate problem. The thing it had solved was not primarily insomnia, it was the noise. And having experienced a version of quiet, Stewie wanted to get back there. Section 10. The Gun in the Vault. Brian and Stewie, Season 8. The 17th episode of the 8th season of Family Guy aired on the 2nd of May 2010, and it is, by any honest accounting, the most unusual thing the show produced across its entire run. It is called Brian and Stewie, and it breaks with the format of the series so completely and so deliberately that it reads almost as an argument made from inside the show about what the show could be if it chose to be something different. There are no cutaway gags. In the original broadcast version, there is no music except for the songs played during the closing credits, which are drawn from earlier seasons. There are no other characters except in that credit sequence. The episode takes place entirely inside a bank vault over the course of a weekend, and its cast consists of Brian Griffin and Stewie Griffin and nothing else. They arrive at the bank together for reasons that are initially separate. Brian to make a deposit in his safe deposit box, Stewie to return a $3,000 Tom Brown sweater to a shop nearby. They are still inside when the vault door closes at the end of the business day, automatically, locking them inside until Monday morning. They have an energy bar in Stewie's bag. They have each other. The first portion of the episode is comedic in the register that Brian and Stewie interactions usually inhabit sharp, slightly cruel in the way of people who know each other well enough to find the pressure points, built on the specific dynamic of Stewie's imperious demands and Brian's exasperated compliance. The comedy is good. It is the kind of comedy these two characters reliably produce when the writers give them space to produce it, but it is also clearly preliminary. The episode is not interested in the comedy for its own sake. It is interested in where the comedy gives way to something else. Brian's safe deposit box contains, among other things, a bottle of Glenfiddich Scotch whiskey. He opens it. Stewie demands a sip. Brian considers the wisdom of giving alcohol to a baby and then decides, in the context of being locked inside a bank vault with no other options and a weekend to fill, that the question of wisdom has become somewhat academic. They both drink. Stewie, who has a predictable relationship with alcohol given his body mass and developmental stage, becomes drunk fairly quickly. Brian, who has been drinking for many years, takes longer. The drunk sequence that follows is one of the episode's funniest sustained passages. Stewie, intoxicated, becomes a specific and somewhat heightened version of himself, more honest about what he wants, more direct about what he feels, less filtered by the layers of sophistication and deflection he usually maintains. He persuades Brian to pierce his ear with a pin from his sweater, which Brian does, leaving Stewie with a bloodied ear for the remainder of the episode. This is a minor indignity among the several the episode visits on both of them, and it is played for the comedy of the commitment. Brian piercing a baby's ear while drunk in a bank vault is the kind of image that is so specifically absurd that it stops being absurd through sheer sustained presentation. Stewie, also drunk, manages to cause Brian's handgun to discharge accidentally. The bullet bounces around the interior of the vault, the walls, the ceiling, the floor in a sequence that is both funny and genuinely alarming, the randomness of the ricochet making each bounce something that cannot be predicted. They shelter under the table. They wait for the bullet to stop moving. The comedy of the sequence is inseparable from its danger. The gun, this is the thing the episode has been building toward, and it arrives after they sober up on energy bars and wait through another portion of the weekend with nothing to do but exist in each other's company. Stewie, who knows Brian well and who has been paying attention, asks about the gun. The question is simple and direct. Why does Brian have a gun in a safe deposit box? Brian is a registered gun control advocate. He has spoken publicly about his grief over gun violence. He is, in Stewie's assessment, and in the assessment of anyone who has watched the show with any attention, not a person who should own a firearm, and not a person who keeps firearms in safety deposit boxes, and not a person who would do this unless there was a reason that was not the ordinary reason a person might give for owning a gun. Brian does not want to answer. He deflects, which is the thing Brian does when the question is getting too close to the truth of something. He changes the subject. He offers a different topic. He exercises the skills of a person who has spent many years directing conversations away from the places he does not want them to go. Stewie persists. And eventually, because the weekend is long and the vault is sealed and there is nowhere to go, Brian tells him he has the gun because he has thought about ending his life. Not in an acute sense, not in the sense of a crisis that requires immediate intervention, but as a long-standing awareness that the option exists and that keeping the option available is something he has chosen to do. He has the scotch because he has thought about a last drink. He clarifies that he came to the bank to deposit his Christmas savings. The gun and the scotch were not brought there today for any immediate purpose. They have been in the box for a while. What Brian describes, in the language the episode gives him, is the specific ache of being something that does not have a clean category. He is a dog who thinks like a person. He has the consciousness and the emotional register, and the ambitions and the disappointments of a person. He wants to be taken seriously as a writer, which means he has the writer's particular vulnerability to the gap between what you are and what you wanted to be. He has spent years watching the Griffins navigate their lives while he navigates something adjacent to that life, but not the same thing, not quite. He does not know what he is for, in the way that a dog knows what it is for guarding, retrieving, companionship, the roles that dogs occupy without having to ask why they occupy them. And he does not know what he is for in the way that a person knows, or at least believes what they are for. He is between categories, and the between has accumulated. The gun is not about a plan. The scotch is not about a timeline. They are about knowing that the option is there. About the specific comfort of having access to an exit if the between becomes unbearable. Stewie's response to this is the episode's most carefully written passage. He does not perform distress. He does not lecture. He does not produce a list of reasons why Brian should reconsider. He sits with what Brian has told him, and he tells Brian, simply and without embellishment, that he matters. That the specific person Brian is not the person he wants to be, not the writer he has not yet become, but the dog sitting in a bank vault on a Saturday night is someone whose presence in the world is valuable to Stewie specifically. This is love in the register that Stewie Griffin is capable of expressing it. Brief, direct, without sentimentality, offered as a fact rather than a feeling. He does not ask Brian to promise anything. He does not extract assurances. He says the thing and then he does not say it again, and the episode moves gently toward the morning. The alcohol in this episode is not the enemy. It is the bridge. Brian could not have said what he said sober. The Glenfiddich created a space in which the truth could be spoken, and Stewie's presence in that space meant the truth was received by someone who would hold it carefully. The drinking led to the gun's discharge, which was dangerous and comic. The drinking also led to the conversation that the episode needed to happen. This is Family Guy at its most honest about what alcohol actually does in human and apparently canine experience. It opens things that are usually closed. Sometimes what is opened is worth the opening. Sometimes what is opened is the danger. The episode contains both, simultaneously, in the same vault, over the same weekend, with the same bottle. Section 11. The Bigger Picture. What Family Guy understood about wanting too much. If you watch these episodes in sequence from the toad-licking craze of Season 2 to Brian's cocaine collapse in Season 3, through the various alcohol stories and the food obsessions and the fixations on songs and the cough syrup in the baby's crib, something emerges from the accumulation that does not exist in any single episode. A portrait of wanting that is more complete and more nuanced than you would expect from a show whose primary mode is irreverence. Family Guy was, for most of its run, a show that did not believe in consequences. The reset button was hit at the end of almost every episode. Characters who learned something in one installment forgot the lesson by the next. Peter, who received the death vision in Friends of Peter G. and committed to moderation, was, several seasons later, participating in a 2-night blackout bender that ended in him and his friends accidentally marrying each other. Brian, who sobered up from cocaine and left Spooner Street in search of purpose, came back essentially unchanged and continued drinking. Stewie, who swore off alcohol after 5 martinis at the Drunken Clam, eventually reached for the cough syrup in Season 13. The show's awareness of this pattern is visible in the later seasons, in the moments where characters break the fourth wall to acknowledge that nothing sticks, that the show is too old and too set in its ways to actually change. These meta moments are sometimes funny and sometimes self-defeating, which is an interesting combination of outcomes for a show making jokes about its own creative limitations. But the reset button, frustrating as it is when you are invested in a character's development, accidentally produces something that is true about compulsive behavior in general. It comes back. The thing you thought you were finished with appears again, in a different form, with a different object, in a different season, and requires a new reckoning. The person who got sober and then got not sober and then got sober again is not describing a failure of will or a weakness of character in most cases. They are describing the nature of compulsive patterns, which have a persistence and a recurrence that does not yield to a single decision, however sincerely made. Family Guy's serial resets, read this way, are less an artistic failure than an accidental truth. The pattern does not end because you had a vision from death or an emotional conversation in a bank vault. It continues. It requires renegotiation again and again, at different points in the life of the person or the show. The thing about compulsion is that you do not beat it once and move on. You negotiate with it indefinitely. The characters who carry the addiction stories across the show's 20-plus year run are, without exception, characters who are trying to solve a problem. This is the first and most consistent observation the show's addiction episodes make. Nobody reaches for the cocaine, or the burger, or the beer, or the cough syrup because things are going well and they want to go better. They reach for it because something is missing or wrong or insufficient, and the thing they are reaching for offers to address the insufficiency in a way that is immediate and reliable even if it is temporary. Brian's cocaine use begins because he has lost the sense of purpose that made his days feel worth having. Peter's 30 burgers are an attempt to maximize the pleasure of access until the pleasure collapses under its own weight. Stewie's cough syrup is an attempt to quiet a mind that does not know how to be quiet. Brian's drinking, across the whole run, is an attempt to manage the particular existential condition of being between categories, not quite a dog, not quite a person, not quite the writer he intended to become. The substance is never the cause. The substance is the proposed solution to a cause that predates it. This is the architecture of every meaningful addiction story the show ever told, and it is accurate enough to the real experience of compulsive behavior that it is worth noting, even inside the framework of an animated comedy. The second consistent observation is about the people around the person who is using. Family Guy's addiction episodes are interesting partly because of what they reveal about the supporting cast. Lois's response to Brian's cocaine collapse is steady and practical. She organizes the intervention, she clears space for it, she redirects the family's energy toward the problem without hysteria. Her knowledge of the street value of 4.5 kilos of uncut cocaine, noted as an incidental detail in The Thin White Line and never explained, is one of the show's more intriguing background details about a character whose past is occasionally implied to be more complicated than her present. Peter's response to Brian's rehab is to check himself in alongside him, which is both deeply inappropriate and, in its way, a form of loyalty. He does not want Brian to be alone in an unfamiliar place. Stewie's response to Brian's confession in the vault is the one the episode is built toward, and it is exactly what the moment needs. Not performed comfort, not a list of reasons, but simple presence and a simply stated truth. The show also made, across its long run, a distinction that not all television manages. The difference between substances that were depicted as genuinely dangerous and substances that were depicted as socially criminalized rather than inherently harmful. Brian's cocaine was dangerous. The episode made no argument that the cocaine itself was fine, only that Brian's use of it was his own responsibility. Brian's marijuana, in episode 420, was argued to be socially criminalized rather than inherently harmful. The episode is a piece of advocacy, and it is not subtle about which side of the advocacy it is on. The distinction matters because collapsing all substance use into a single moral category is one of the ways that conversations about drug policy have consistently gone wrong, and the show, in its inconsistent and occasionally accidental way, did not collapse it. The third observation, and perhaps the most important, is about what happens when someone decides to stop. The show's addiction episodes are almost uniformly honest about the difficulty of this. Brian does not simply decide to stop using cocaine and then stop. He goes to rehab. He has an intervention. He leaves Spooner Street because he cannot find the equilibrium the recovery requires in the environment where the breakdown happened. Peter does not simply decide to drink less and then drink less. He receives a vision of the future from death and constructs an elaborate personal system involving throwing half his beer in the garbage before he can drink it. Stewie does not simply decide to stop using cough syrup and then stop. He goes through an intervention staged by his toys and an admission of the problem that costs him something real. The difficulty of stopping is depicted with honesty because it is genuinely difficult, and a show that depicts it as simple as a matter of deciding to stop and then stopping is not doing the subject justice. Family Guy does not always do the subject justice, but in the moments when it does, it is honest about what the moments of decision actually cost. What the show ultimately understood, across all of these episodes and all of these years, is that wanting too much is not a character flaw in the moral sense. It is a feature of the human or the canine or the baby genius architecture. The Griffin household is full of people who want things too much, who cannot stop reaching for one more of whatever they are reaching for, who confuse abundance for satisfaction and who discover, repeatedly, that the confusion is self-perpetuating. More does not solve the problem that more was supposed to solve. It just creates a new context in which the same problem recurs. This is true of the big substances, cocaine, alcohol, the cough syrup, and it is true of the small ones. The song Peter could not stop playing, the burgers he ate past the point where eating was pleasant, the social status that Lando Griffin briefly achieved and that Peter could not let go of even when holding onto it meant hurting Meg. The pattern is the same. The scale and the consequence differ. The wanting is the constant. Peter Griffin, sitting at the kitchen table in the small hours of a Spooner Street night, is the show in miniature. He has an 8-pack of beer rather than a 6-pack, and this single detail noted in passing in the thin white line, during a scene set before Brian's breakdown, says something that the show is not trying to highlight, but that sits there anyway, visible to anyone paying attention. He is not having the last beer of the night. He has bought himself a slightly larger version of the ordinary amount, which means the ordinary amount was not quite enough to begin with. This is not a crisis. It is Tuesday. It is the baseline from which crisis occasionally emerges and to which it returns. It is the family on Spooner Street, wanting in their various ways, reaching in their various directions, never quite arriving, but always, always continuing to reach. That is what Family Guy understood, in its better moments, about the nature of addiction. Not that it is dramatic, not that it is obvious, but that it is ordinary, that it lives inside the texture of everyday life, in the extra cans purchased and the extra serving eaten, and the song played one more time after everyone has asked you to stop. And that the distance between ordinary wanting and the kind of wanting that causes real damage is shorter than most of us like to believe. The show ran for more than 25 years. The Griffins reached for things across all of it. They will keep reaching for as long as the show continues. The pattern does not break. It just gets retold in different episodes with different objects for a different week's audience. And somehow that is both the most comedic and the most honest thing about it. If you made it to the end of this one genuinely, thank you. These long, deep dives take time to put together, and it means everything to know they are keeping someone company. Drop a comment with where you are in the world right now and what time it is there. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. I will see you then. Supplementary deep dive, the supporting cast and their compulsions. One of the things that makes Family Guy's addiction episodes feel like a genuine body of work rather than a collection of isolated episodes is that the compulsive behavior does not belong exclusively to the 2 or 3 characters who carry the major arcs. It spreads laterally through the cast, appearing in smaller moments, in background details, in the choices that secondary and tertiary characters make that the show depicts without necessarily foregrounding. Cleveland Brown, before he departed Spooner Street for his own spin-off series, was a character whose quiet steadiness masked a degree of emotional repression that the show touched on occasionally without ever fully committing to exploring. Cleveland's marriage to Loretta was troubled in ways that the show depicted partly through her infidelity and partly through the suggestion that Cleveland's very calmness, the equanimity he brought to every situation, was itself a form of avoidance, a refusal to engage with difficulty that eventually made the difficulty inevitable. His relationship with alcohol was not a major storyline, but Cleveland at the Drunken Clam was rarely the person nursing a single drink across an entire evening. He matched Peter beer for beer, and the matching was never examined, because the show was not interested in examining Cleveland the way it was interested in examining Brian or Peter. Joe Swanson, similarly, carried his drinking in the background of nearly every drunken clam scene across the show's entire run. Joe's character was organized around the specific tragedy of a man who was, by his own telling, defined by his physical capability, his strength, his toughness, his ability to do the things that police officers and athletes and admired men were supposed to do, and who lost the physical expression of that capability in the line of duty. What replaced it was the social world of the drunken clam, and within that social world, the drinking was less a pleasure than a constant. The beers were not something Joe reached for because they made him feel good. They were the texture of an evening that would otherwise have been formless. This distinction between drinking as pleasure and drinking as structure is one the show gestured at without quite articulating. Quagmire, for all his obvious associations with other forms of compulsive behavior, was actually one of the characters whose relationship with alcohol was the most casually depicted and the least examined. The show was not interested in Glenn Quagmire as an alcoholic because Quagmire's compulsions ran in a different direction, and the show had already made a significant investment in those compulsions as a comedic and occasionally disturbing territory. His drinking was ambient, unremarkable, the standard operating level of a character whose social world was organized around bars and the encounters bars made possible. What is interesting about all four of these men, Peter, Cleveland, Joe, Quagmire sitting at their regular table at the Drunken Clam across more than 20 years of episodes, is that the show never quite asked what the bar actually was for them. The surface answer is obvious. It is where they socialize, where they catch up with each other, where the texture of the day gets discussed and resolved over drinks. But the Drunken Clam is also, in the reading the show supports if you watch carefully, the place where the things that cannot be discussed anywhere else do not get discussed at all. The bar is not a place of confession. It is a place of companionship, which is different, and the companionship operates partly by maintaining a surface that the drinks help maintain. You can sit with three friends and drink for several hours and talk about very little that matters and feel, by the end of the evening, that you have been in meaningful company. The drinks make this possible. They create a warmth, a looseness, a sense of shared time that the occasion might not produce on its own. This is not addiction, exactly, in the clinical sense. But it is the social infrastructure within which addiction can quietly develop and sustain itself almost invisibly, because everyone at the table is doing the same thing, and the sameness provides its own cover. Nobody looks at Peter's 8-pack because everyone at the table is drinking beer. Nobody says anything about how often the Drunken Clam comes up in conversation, because the Drunken Clam is where they all go, every evening, as a matter of course. The show understood this social dimension of drinking more clearly in its early seasons than in its later ones. The Drunken Clam of Season 1 and 2 was a specific and warmly observed space, a blue-collar bar in a New England city where men who worked unglamorous jobs came to decompress in unglamorous ways, and the unglamorousness was the point. It was not aspirational. It was honest about what it was and what it was for. As the show went on, and the characters' lives became more broadly cartoonish, the bar became more of a set piece and less of a place, and some of the social realism that had made those early bar scenes feel true faded, along with the careful characterization. A closer look at the language of intervention, something that recurs across the show's addiction episodes that is worth examining specifically, is the language of the intervention, the staging, the speeches, the dynamic of the people gathered around the person who is using, and what the show does and does not allow to be said in those moments. Brian's intervention in The Thin White Line is organized by the family and conducted with a sobriety that is unusual for Family Guy. The family sits in a circle. Brian sits at the center. The speeches are short but specific. They name what has changed, what the family has noticed, what they are asking for. Brian's breakdown is not deferred or deflected by comedy. It is allowed to be what it is, which is a person who has been using something to manage a pain and has finally, in the presence of the people who love him, run out of the ability to maintain the fiction that the managing is going well. The show returns to the intervention form with Stewie in Baking Bad, and the choice to stage the intervention with Stewie's toys rather than with the family members is a decision that works on multiple levels. The toys are the witnesses to the behavior they were present for every instance of the cough syrup use, In the room where it happened, in the space where Stewie spent the time when he was not performing his role within the family. Using the toys as the intervention circle says something about where the truth of the behavior actually lives. Not in the public space of the family, but in the private space of the room, with the objects that were there throughout. The contrast between Brian's intervention and Stewie's is also a contrast in scale. Brian's intervention is a family event. It involves everyone in the household, and its weight comes partly from the scale of the occasion, the fact that multiple people who love him have gathered specifically to tell him that something is wrong. Stewie's intervention is more intimate, more contained, more specific. It is Brian and the toys and the specific room where the specific behavior happened. The smallness of it is part of its honesty. Not every moment of reckoning has to be large. Some of the most important ones are small and specific and happen in the room where the problem lived. The intervention form appears in other contexts in the show as well, not always around substance use, but often around compulsive behavior more broadly. The show understood that the intervention, the gathering of the people who care, the specific and honest naming of what is happening, the request for change is one of the primary social technologies through which compulsive behavior gets addressed, and it returned to the form repeatedly because the form was useful for the stories it wanted to tell. What the show could not do, within its structure, is follow through on the intervention with sustained change. The form appears, the moment happens. The person being intervened upon has a real and usually moving response, and then the next episode, or the next season, they are essentially back where they were. This is the limitation of the serialized comedy format applied to stories about compulsion, and Family Guy was not the only show to encounter it. But the limitation is worth naming, because it shapes what the episodes can and cannot say. They can depict the moment of reckoning. They cannot depict the sustained, unglamorous, non-episodic work of actual recovery, because that work is not compatible with the format's need for reset and repetition. The specific pleasure of early Family Guy addiction stories. There is something worth saying about the difference in tone between the addiction stories of the early seasons 1 through 5, roughly, and those of the later seasons, and the difference is not simply a matter of quality, although it is partly that. The early addiction stories had a specific characteristic that the later ones tended to lose. They were grounded in recognizable human experience while being filtered through the show's absurdist sensibility in a way that kept both things intact. Brian's cocaine use in The Thin White Line is cartoonishly extreme. He becomes a drug-sniffing police dog who develops a cocaine habit, but the emotional experience underneath it, the feeling of finding something that fills the purposelessness and then discovering the fill is temporary and costly, is real. The cartoon and the real coexist without either one crushing the other. By the time you reach the later seasons, the tendency was often to push harder on the cartoon element to make the substance more outrageous, the consequences more extreme, the comedy more dependent on the extremity of the situation in a way that left less room for the human reality underneath. This is not a consistent pattern across all the later episodes, and there are meaningful exceptions. Friends of Peter G. in Season 9, Brian and Stewie in Season 8, but it is a tendency, and it correlates with the broader shift in the show's character writing that the show's trajectory makes visible. The early seasons trusted the audience to feel two things at once. They trusted that a person watching Brian break down at the intervention could find Brian's situation both funny and genuinely moving, and that these two responses did not need to be separated or sequential. The later seasons were more likely to choose one or the other to go fully comedic or to attempt sincerity without the comedy, and the choosing, paradoxically, produced moments that were less fully either thing than the earlier moments had been. What the best Family Guy addiction episodes share, across every season, is the willingness to sit in the discomfort of a character wanting something they should not have and finding a way to have it anyway. This is not comfortable to watch. It is not meant to be comfortable to watch. The discomfort is where the truth lives. In these stories, in the gap between what Brian tells himself about his drinking and what the Glenfiddich in the safety deposit box says about his drinking. In the gap between Peter's belief that 30 burgers represent the logical use of an unlimited supply and what 30 burgers actually produce in a human body. In the gap between Stewie's conviction that he can manage his relationship with the cough syrup and the big wheel accident that disproves it. The discomfort is the show being honest. And whatever else you say about Family Guy, whatever criticisms you level at the later seasons, at the Flanderization of the characters, at the drift from warmth to cruelty, at the cutaway gags that replace storytelling rather than enhancing it in the specific domain of the addiction stories, the show was often more honest than it got credit for, and more precisely observed than the format usually demanded. The Drunken Clam as a character in itself. It would be wrong to talk about addiction and compulsion in Family Guy without spending time with the place where most of it happens. The Drunken Clam, the bar on the corner of a street in a fictional Rhode Island city, with its cracked bar stools and its television set usually tuned to a game that nobody is particularly watching, and its particular geography of regulars who have been sitting in roughly the same seats for as long as the show has been. Running is not just a setting, it is a character. It has a personality, a history, a role in the story that is distinct from the role of any of the people who populate it. In the early seasons, the Drunken Clam was drawn with the specific affection of someone who had spent time in exactly this kind of place and understood what it was for. It was a working-class bar in a small New England city, which is a very specific kind of institution with a very specific cultural function. These bars exist in every post-industrial American city of a certain size and demographic composition, and what they provide is not primarily the alcohol, though the alcohol is part of it. What they provide is a space where the social pressure of elsewhere, of home, of work, of the performance of competence and reliability and patience that adult life requires is temporarily suspended. You do not have to be responsible at the Drunken Clam in the same way you have to be responsible everywhere else. The bar absorbs the day and releases you from it, briefly, into an evening of relatively uncomplicated companionship. Peter Griffin needs this release more than most people, because Peter Griffin's relationship with the demands of ordinary life is more fraught than most people's. He is not good at the things adult life requires. He is not good at patience or planning or the management of consequences. He is not good at remembering how his actions affect the people around him, or at modulating his behavior in response to feedback from those people. The Drunken Clam is the place where none of this is held against him, where Joe and Cleveland and Quagmire accept him exactly as he is, bad decisions and all, because they have known him long enough and drunk with him enough times that his particular species of chaos has become familiar enough to be comfortable. Brian comes to the Drunken Clam for different reasons, and this distinction is worth noting. Brian does not need the release from responsibility in the way Peter does, because Brian's relationship with responsibility is more self-aware and more ambivalent. What Brian needs from the bar is the company of people who will not ask him how the novel is going. Everyone on Spooner Street knows about the novel. The novel is the wound that everyone can see. At the Drunken Clam, surrounded by men who mostly did not go to college and who have no particular interest in literary ambition, Brian can drink his martini without having to perform the version of himself that is the failed writer. He can just be the dog at the bar, which is, in the strange economy of this particular world, a perfectly acceptable thing to be. The Drunken Clam was briefly lost in a Season 2 episode, One If by Clam, Two If by Sea, when a hurricane destroyed it and a British entrepreneur bought the space and converted it into an English pub. The four friends reacted to this with the intensity of people who have lost a piece of their identity, which is probably the right way to understand what the bar meant to them. The story about reclaiming the space was ultimately about the claim these men had on a particular place, and on the version of themselves that place made possible. They were not just fighting for a bar, they were fighting for the specific and irreplaceable experience of being exactly who they were in exactly that room. The bar came back. Of course it came back. The Drunken Clam is one of the fixed points of the Family Guy universe, one of the things that does not change when other things change. And its continued existence across every season of the show, through cast departures and character shifts, and the general entropy of a series that ran long past the point where its original creative energy was intact, is a testament to what the place represents. There is always somewhere to go. There is always the bar. There is always the table in the back, and the beer, and the four friends in roughly the same configuration they have always occupied. This is, depending on how you look at it, either one of the most comforting or one of the most troubling things about the show. The permanence of the Drunken Clam says that some things do not change, that the social structures around drinking are sturdier than the people who inhabit them, that the bar will be there long after the specific individual needs it was designed to meet have evolved into something different. This is true of bars in general. The institution outlasts the individuals. The table is still there after you have learned to want less from it. What remains? More than 460 episodes, more than 25 years. A family in a two-story house, on a street in a fictional Rhode Island city, reaching for things across all of it. The cocaine that came through the nose of a drug-sniffing dog in a Season 3 episode produced a breakdown in a family living room and a journey towards something that Brian could not name at the start of it. The 30 hamburgers that Peter ate in the back of a fast food restaurant produced a stroke and 3 months of paralysis and a campaign against the industry he had used to hurt himself. The toad that Meg held for a popular girl at her high school in Season 2 produced a father who went undercover at his daughter's school and found, briefly, the feeling of being the person everyone wanted to be near, and then found, just as briefly, a way to use that feeling to give his daughter something she needed. The scotch in the safety deposit box at the Quahog Bank produced a conversation in a sealed vault on a Saturday night in which Brian Griffin said something out loud that he had never said before, and the saying of it changed something not permanently, not in the way the show's format permits things to change, but in the moment, in the vault, for the two characters who were there. These are the addiction stories of Family Guy. They are imperfect stories, told imperfectly, within a format that was not designed to tell them. They were interrupted by cutaway gags and reset by the demands of serialized comedy and sometimes abandoned in favor of shock value or spectacle. But they were also, at their best, genuinely observant about what it is to want something too much, and to discover that the wanting has a cost that the wanting itself cannot pay. The Drunken Clam is still open. The table in the back is still occupied. Peter Griffin is still drinking his beer, and somewhere in a bank vault that will open on Monday morning, the Glenfiddich is still sitting in the safe deposit box with the gun, and the weekend is long, and Brian Griffin and Stewie Griffin are still talking. This is the show. All of it. The absurdity and the honesty, and the things it knew about wanting, and the things it could never quite bring itself to say. All of it sitting there together, in every episode, in every reach toward one more beer or one more burger or one more play of the record before bed. The bird is the word, and the word, after 25 years of Family Guy, might just be more. Thank you for watching this all the way through. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever time it is there, I am glad you were here for this one. Leave a comment below. Subscribe if this is the kind of thing you want more of. There is always another layer to go deeper into, and I will see you in the next video. A note on why these stories matter in long-form comedy. One final thing worth considering before we close this out. Why does a show like Family Guy keep returning to the theme of addiction and compulsion across more than 2 decades, when the format does not require it and the reset button means nothing changes anyway? The answer might be simpler than it appears. Family Guy. For all its irreverence and its willingness to be offensive and its fondness for jokes that have no landing place except the shock of the thing itself, is at its foundation a show about a family trying to hold together. The Griffins are imperfect people, cartoonishly imperfect, exaggeratedly imperfect, imperfect in ways that make them funny rather than simply exhausting, and the things that make them imperfect are the same things that make them interesting to watch. Their hungers, their reaches, the gap between what they want and what they have and the things they do to try to close the gap. Addiction stories in this reading are just the most concentrated version of what every Family Guy episode is about. They are the episodes where the wanting is biggest and the consequences are clearest, and the distance between the reach and the reckoning is shortest. They are the episodes where you can see most plainly what it means to be someone who cannot stop wanting, in a world that offers an endless supply of things to want. Which is to say, they are the most human episodes the show produced, even when the human in question is a dog.